This is the second part of a two-part series of videos for practice managers about hiring GP locums, getting the best out of your locum. It covers good practice in support and in risk management. I'm Paula Wright. It's worth pausing for a moment to understand the differing perspectives of the practice and the locum. So, what would constitute an ideal locum from a practice point of view, and what would constitute an ideal locum job from the GP's point of view? So from the practice's point of view, one often hears the following, that you want the fee to be reasonable, the locum to be flexible, familiar with services and systems, and reliable. And of course this is all in addition to being basically a good GP, so somebody experienced and competent, polite, efficient, who doesn't run late and doesn't get complaints. In contrast, what a GP is looking for in a locum job is that the practice will respect the workload that's been agreed in advance, that it's well organised, providing adequate logins and induction information in a timely way, that there is support both from clinicians and receptionists in terms of providing information, equipment and supplies for the room, and that at the end your superannuation forms are signed promptly and payment is made promptly as well. So why do GPs choose to work as locums? Well, we know from many surveys that it's predominantly to do with control over workload. So control over the number of patients they see, the number of days they work, when they take holidays, the number of hours they want to work in any given week, the timing of those surgeries, and so on. And this is to do both with balancing their general practice role with caring responsibilities and other portfolios, but also so that they can feel they can work more safely at an intensity which is in keeping with their competence and their working preferences. Unfortunately, there are quite a lot of downsides to working as a locum, so they experience more isolation, lack of information about education and services and prescribing, financial insecurity, no sick pay, no death and service benefit. They're often excluded from education, and they're far more exposed if they are subject to a GMC complaint. An interesting finding from a recent survey where we asked locums to share their experiences of agreeing explicit terms was that when locums felt unhappy, they tended to just leave rather than try and resolve the issue. And if they felt the practice or the role was unsafe, they tend to leave at very short notice. For this reason, locums often tended to stick to practices that they knew already. So there's two ways in which the locum fee can be defined. Some people prefer to go by time, so they charge a fee for an hourly rate, and the downsides to this are that you don't know what the speed is at which the locum works, so what they'll be able to achieve for each hour, and therefore you're agreeing to a variable fee. It may appear more flexible because you can ask them to do whatever needs to be done on the day, potentially, but you have the uncertainty of the fee. There's also increased risk for the locum because they may be expected to work outside of their comfort zone. In terms of the other alternative, which is to price fees for a certain workload, there's greater clarity for that on both sides. It can appear less flexible to the practice because if you then, for example, have no visits and you've been priced for visits, potentially you're paying a fee for work that you haven't needed. It is used more commonly, and it allows locums to ensure that they keep to a level of comfort and competency that's within their experience. It's worth just being aware about the difference between having a GP work for you on a self-employed basis as a locum and having somebody work for you on an employed basis as a salaried GP. So if they're self-employed, they will expect to have control over their work, what work they do, when and how they do it, and not be under direct supervision. Whereas an employed salaried GP, of course, would expect their workload to be determined by their place of work and also how it's done and when it should be finished. So you can't expect to have the same degree of control over a locum GP that you would have over a salaried GP. One question that comes up a lot is, when does a locum become an employee? And at this point in time, it's important to recognise that the regulations that govern tax and employment rights don't completely overlap. And then for locums, there is the additional complication of the pensions. So I'm not going to go into the detail of this in this presentation, but there are some points here that if you wish to read, you can pause the video to look at. Here are some interesting quotes from a recent survey of locums and their experiences with practice. I feel unhappy to return to practices that don't have insight into the difficulties locum doctors face and why they have to set terms and fees. Negotiating workload is generally easier, but extra urgent work on the day, etc., and some fluid requests can be difficult. Also, last-minute cancellation can be difficult to deal with. I like smiling, friendly staff, organised locum folder, well-stocked room, and it's nice to have a glimpse of one of the partners so you know who you're working for. So why is induction important? Well, I have a video on this, but in summary, there's safety. So CQC will expect up-to-date policies and procedures and for all staff to be informed about them. There's an issue of efficiency. So if you have good induction, there'll be less time looking for information, logins, supplies, correcting errors, and handling complaints. Then there's recruitment. If you support a locum well with induction, they're likely to come back and work for you. And finally, there's a confidence issue, that patients can have confidence that the quality of the service they get is consistent regardless of the GP they're seeing. You want to consider how best to support your locum so that they can deliver the best standard of care. And this starts with an adequate induction, having all their logins for the clinical system ready and the room well stocked, tidy and ready to work. The next level of support is around making sure that they're able to not only provide feedback on their experience, but also able to receive friendly and constructive feedback about their work. They can be included in meetings, they know how to report significant events, and they're informed of any significant events arising from their patients, and that they're also included in any handling of any complaints that they may be unfortunate enough to receive, so that they can consult their medical defence union and contribute to the response. The next level of support is helping them with their appraisal process, so they may need access to notes, or they may need to carry out a patient survey or a colleague survey. And the final level is they may need or may benefit from help if you keep them informed about any educational opportunities in the area, any changes to services or prescribing newsletters, and also they may need a sponsor to help them obtain or retain an NHS.net email address, as this can be quite difficult for a locum to obtain or retain. So how do you make sure that you minimise any risk arising from the use of locums? Well, it starts with making sure that the doctor you're taking on is trained and competent, but that's just the beginning. There's providing an adequate induction with showing them where defibrillator and drugs are and many other things. There's making sure their room is adequately stocked and they know how to access support for both clinicians and non-clinical staff, that they're working to a safe workload agreed with them, that they know how to be part of the significant event process, they know how to access practice protocols, and that any feedback that they provide to the practice around any difficulties is followed up and acted on. The locum can also take on responsibility for many aspects of making sure that their practice is safe, so keeping up to date with education and their appraisal, recognising the limits of their competence, and part of this is making sure that the workload they agree to do is within their experience and competence, making sure that they work in practices where they know the computer system and checking out that the practice setup is one they're comfortable working in, having very clearly defined terms and conditions, particularly regarding workload, asking for an induction and knowing when to ask for support, producing clear medical records and taking time with handovers for more complex patients such as safeguarding or palliative care patients, and finally knowing how to raise problems and provide feedback, and also to receive feedback and be part of the significant event process. GMC has useful guidance on the issue of prescribing and repeat prescribing. So it says that when you issue repeat prescriptions, you must be satisfied that the procedures for generating the prescriptions are secure, also that the patient's condition is monitored, and that only staff who are competent to do so prepare repeat prescriptions for authorisation. Any changes to the patient's medicines are critically reviewed and quickly incorporated into their record. So there are quite a lot of things that you need to be satisfied with as a locum before you can safely sign repeat prescriptions in the same way as a doctor who is a substantive member of that team. The following quotes from locums in our survey reflects these considerations. I don't like to be asked by nurse or receptionist to just sign this. I state in my confirmation email that I don't do nurse or repeat prescribing. Not safe. I don't know most of their patients or the thoroughness of their med reviews. I will agree to sign on occasions, provided medication reviews are in date, items on script are in line with prescribing guidance and are straightforward. I won't sign, for example, NSAIDs or night sedation on repeat. So if we look at the possible scenarios where a locum might be asked to sign prescriptions, obviously prescribing within the consultation is the gold standard in keeping with GMC guidance, so they have full access to patient record, there's time to assess and counsel the patient. The next scenario is where the locum is confident that the medication review systems exist, they're known to him or her, and they're safe, including protocols for the nurse practitioner and practice nurse. And this is really only likely to arise if they're doing a longer term locum or are familiar with the practice. The other possibility here, where they may be prepared to sign repeat prescriptions, is if they're allocated time to review each record for each prescription. And this scenario tends to only arise where there have been no visits and there's been prior agreement with a locum. A situation where the locum is unfamiliar with the practice, or they feel the medication review systems are unsafe, they're being asked to sign prescriptions for high-risk drugs such as NSAIDs, controlled drugs, Z drugs, or on behalf of other clinicians whose protocols and competence they're unfamiliar with, they're unlikely to agree. Also, they're unlikely to agree to sign scripts outside of the review period, as they would have to review each individual patient record to make a safe decision and may not have been allocated time for this. Although often a practice is hiring a locum in a situation of difficulty and pressure, it's worth thinking about the benefits that can actually come to the practice through hiring a locum. The first one to mention is that it's a fresh pair of eyes on cases that may have run into difficulty. Fresh pair of clinician eyes can sometimes bring a new approach or find things that have been missed. The second point is that locums, by moving around between practices, can act as a form of cross-fertilisation of ideas and innovations that have occurred in neighbouring practices. The third point is that they offer really important respite when a partner or a doctor is off sick, and also allow the substantive doctors in a practice to pursue outside interests. And finally, having a locum in your practice is a good way of potentially recruiting a new GP, and for the GP to find out whether they like the practice and whether the practice likes the GP. So I'm often asked what's the best way to write a successful locum advert, and what I've said to practice managers who've asked me this is that, as well as writing the key facts such as location, the type of practice, whether it's training or single-handed, the computer system and the dates, whilst it's helpful to describe the normal working pattern of the practice, it's important to remember that locums have chosen this way of working with less security in order to have control over their workload. And so it's important to convey that you're prepared to be flexible at the same time as conveying a preference for exactly the type of arrangements that you're looking for. So it's important to remember that locums are self-employed workers, and they very much define their own way of working. So I hope you found those practical examples useful. Do get in touch with me to give me your feedback at my NHSnet address, and consider subscribing to my YouTube channel. Thank you.